The matter began, as so many disturbances in Flaxborough did, with something so small and faintly inconvenient that it might have been dismissed entirely had it not occurred in a place where inconvenience was taken rather seriously. The allotments lay beyond the railway embankment, a tidy congregation of plots where cabbages, onions, and personal pride grew in equal measure. On a mild Tuesday morning, the regular occupants arrived as usual, Mr. Gedge with his measuring tape and exacting eye, Mrs. Pottle with her basket and commentary, and Mr. Dinsdale, who spoke little but noticed everything. It was Mrs. Pottle who first observed that something was not quite right. "Well now," she remarked, pausing before shed number 7, "that door was not standing open yesterday." Her tone carried the mild disapproval of a woman accustomed to doors behaving themselves. Mr. Gedge adjusted his spectacles and approached with caution, as though the shed might take offence at inspection. A draught, perhaps, he suggested, though without conviction or carelessness. Mrs. Pottle sniffed, a gesture which in Flaxborough served as both punctuation and judgment. Mr. Larkins is not a careless man. He keeps his hinges oiled, which is more than can be said for most. Mr. Dinsdale said nothing, but his eyes lingered on the door, which indeed stood ajar by several inches, just enough to imply disturbance, but not enough to declare it openly. There was, for a moment, a collective hesitation. Entering another man's shed was not a step taken lightly. It suggested either emergency or curiosity, and Flaxborough prided itself on distinguishing between the two. Mrs. Pottle resolved the matter. "Well, we cannot have things left like this," she said, pushing the door further with the handle of her basket. The interior presented no immediate catastrophe. The tools hung in their accustomed places, the small wooden bench bore its usual clutter, and a faint scent of fertilizer lingered. Yet there was something not missing precisely, but altered in a way that resisted immediate explanation. Mr. Gedge leaned in, frowning. "His spade," he said slowly. "That one there, he always keeps it on the left peg, not the right." Mrs. the Pottle peered closer. "I would not swear to it." "I would," Mr. Gedge replied, with the quiet firmness of a man who had, on more than one occasion, sworn to less significant matters. Mr. Dinsdale stepped forward at last. He glanced about the shed, then down at the floor. A faint scuff marked the soil near the threshold, as though a boot had turned sharply. "Someone's been here," he said. This observation, though simple, altered the atmosphere entirely. Mrs. Pottle drew herself up. "Well, that is quite out of order indeed." Within minutes, the allotments were no longer a place of solitary industry, but a forum of speculation. By the time Mr. Larkins himself arrived slightly breathless and already aware that something had occurred, he found a small assembly waiting with expressions that combined sympathy and restrained excitement. "What's all this, then?" he asked, though his gaze had already fixed upon the open shed. Mrs. Pottle delivered the news with a solemnity that might have suited a telegram. "Your shed, Mr. Larkins. It appears to have been interfered with." Mr. Larkins stepped inside, his movements careful, as though unwilling to disturb whatever trace of the event remained. He looked at the tools, the bench, the corners where sacks were stacked. His face, ordinarily placid, developed a crease of genuine concern. "I locked it," he said. "I always lock it." Mr. Gedge nodded gravely. We had not supposed otherwise. There followed a silence during which each person present considered in their own fashion what might constitute interference. Theft seemed unlikely. Nothing obvious was gone. Vandalism was equally absent. Yet the sense of intrusion remained, quiet but undeniable. "It may be nothing," Mrs. Pottle conceded, though without enthusiasm. "A boy, perhaps, or someone looking for shelter?" Mr. Larkins shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "No, it's not that." He pointed, not at the misplaced spade, but at a small wooden box on the bench. Its lid stood slightly askew. "I keep that shut," he added. Mr. Dinsdale's eyes narrowed. "What's in it?" Mr. Larkins hesitated just briefly. "Odds and ends," he said. "Nothing of value," which in Flaxborough was precisely the sort of statement that invited further attention. By mid-morning, the matter had travelled beyond the allotments and into the town proper, acquiring along the way several interpretations, none entirely consistent. By noon, it had reached the police station, where it presented itself not as a crime exactly, but as something that might, with proper handling, become one. Inspector Purbright listened to the account with his usual attentive stillness, his fingers lightly touching the edge of his desk. He asked a few questions, nothing pressing, nothing that suggested urgency, and then thanked the informant with quiet courtesy. "A shed, you say?" he murmured, almost to himself. "Opened, but not emptied." He paused, as though considering not the shed itself, but the sort of person who might open it. "Well," he said at last, rising with unhurried deliberation, "we had better go and have a look." And with that, the quiet order of Flaxborough took its first, almost imperceptible step toward disturbance. Inspector Purbright did not approach the allotments with the air of a man expecting revelation. He came along the narrow path with Sergeant Love at his shoulder, and with the mild, almost apologetic expression that had led more than one citizen of Flaxborough to underestimate him until it was too late for comfort. The morning had ripened into one of those industrious town days when everyone was out for some practical purpose, and half of them secretly preferred interruption. By the time Purbright reached shed number 7, a number of practical purposes had arranged themselves into a respectable audience. Mrs. Pottle stood nearest, having placed herself in the position most likely to be useful. Mr. Gedge hovered with the anxious dignity of a man determined to assist accurately. Mr. Dinsdale remained a little back, neither eager nor shy, and Mr. Larkins himself waited by the open door with his hat in both hands. Purbright looked first at the people and then at the shed, as if judging which was likely to mislead him. "Well," he said gently, "it has certainly been visited." Mrs. Pottle gave a small sound of approval. She liked policemen best when they noticed the obvious without arrogance. Mr. Larkins repeated that the shed had been locked the previous evening. He was a spare, careful man with the complexion of someone who had spent years in weather without ever becoming part of it. His moustache trembled faintly whenever he came near. Purbright invited him to show precisely what was wrong. The tour of the interior proceeded slowly. Nothing had been smashed, forced, or stolen in any ordinary sense. The lock bore no sign of damage. The tools were present. A coil of twine, 3 packets of seed, a paraffin can, and a biscuit tin full of nails all remained as they ought. Yet the feeling of disturbance persisted, like a sentence with one word missing. Purbright paused before the small wooden box on the bench. "This is the one you mentioned?" Mr. Larkins nodded. "Yes, I keep bits in there, receipts mostly. Notes, a spare key or two, that sort of thing." "A very mixed company," said Purbright. He lifted the lid. Inside were indeed odds and ends, folded papers, string, pencil stubs, 2 seed catalogues, an old bus timetable, and a little brass padlock without a key. Purbright touched nothing at first. He merely looked. "Have you gone through it since discovering the door open?" "No, not properly. I did not wish to interfere." A faint glow of approval appeared in Sergeant Love's expression. Citizens who did not interfere with possible evidence were as pleasing to him as orderly chrysanthemums. Purbright began to sort the contents carefully. Presently he drew out several receipts from an ironmonger's shop, a note concerning fertilizer delivery, and an envelope containing £3 notes. Mrs. Pottle, who could not see the money from where she stood, looked as though she felt it spiritually. "Still there, you see," said Mr. Larkins with a touch of relief, "so it cannot have been theft." "Not every search is for money," Purbright replied. At that, Mr. Larkins looked at him quickly, and something in the glance did not escape notice. It was not guilt exactly, but the discomfort of a man who would rather a question remained unasked. Purbright removed the remaining papers. At the bottom of the box lay a square patch of cleaner wood, as though something flat had rested there for a long time and had lately been removed. "You kept an object here," he said. Mr. Larkins wet his lips. "I suppose I may have done it." "What object?" There was a short pause. Around the shed the listeners performed those tiny social adjustments by which curiosity tries to resemble concern. "Oh, just an old notebook," said Mr. Larkins at last. "Garden accounts. Nothing important." Mr. Gedge blinked. "You never mentioned a notebook?" "No reason why I should." Mrs. Pottle's eyebrows rose with almost devotional precision. In Flaxborough, a notebook that had not been mentioned promptly acquired significance out of sheer discretion. Purbright asked when Mr. Larkins had last seen it. "Yesterday afternoon, I think. Or the day before. I cannot be exact." "You are a careful man, Mr. Larkins." "I try to be." "Yes," said Purbright. "That is partly why I ask." He stepped outside and examined the lock, then the threshold, then the ground beside the shed. The scuff in the soil was still visible, though beginning to lose its sharpness. Nearby, near the runner bean canes, he stooped and picked up something so small that Sergeant Love did not at first see it. It was a button, dark brown, slightly chipped, and of the stout utilitarian sort favoured by serviceable jackets rather than decorative coats. Purbright turned it over in his palm. "Has this any connection with your wardrobe, Mr. Larkins?" Mr. Larkins looked and shook his head. Mr. Dinsdale, speaking for the first time in several minutes, said, "Looks like one off a council overall, or an old gardening coat. Half the men in town own something of that kind," said Mr. Gedge. "Quite," said Purbright. He slipped the button into an envelope and turned back to the shed, though his thoughts had moved elsewhere. A locked place opened without force, a missing notebook too quickly dismissed, and a man who seemed less concerned about intrusion than about the nature of what had been found. As the little crowd began to loosen into conversational clusters, the gossip already shifting into fresh shapes, Purbright asked one last question in a tone so mild that it might have passed for an afterthought. "Tell me, Mr. Larkins, who besides yourself knew that notebook was kept in the box?" Mr. Larkins did not answer at once. The question, though quietly put, seemed to settle upon him with a weight he had not anticipated. His fingers moved along the brim of his hat in a small, repetitive motion, as though testing its solidity. "Well," he said at last, "no one, really. Not in any particular way." Purbright regarded him with polite patience. "You must forgive me," he said. "I have found that not in any particular way can sometimes include a great many particulars." A faint ripple of restrained amusement passed through Mrs. Pottle, who considered this a very proper remark. Mr. Larkins cleared his throat. "I may have mentioned it in passing. One does, you know, in conversation." "To whom?" "Oh, people about Mr. Gedge, perhaps. Mr. Harbottle once or twice. No one of consequence." Mr. Gedge stiffened slightly. "I do not recall any notebook," he said, with a firmness that suggested he would have preferred not to be recalled in that connection at all. "Quite," said Purbright. "And Mr. Harbottle?" "He has not been down to the allotments in some weeks," Mr. Dinsdale observed. "Gout?" "Indeed," said Purbright, making no comment upon whether gout excluded knowledge. He allowed the matter to rest there, though not, it seemed, to conclude. Instead, he asked Mr. Larkins to accompany him to the station later in the day, bringing with him any further papers relating to the allotment. The request was framed as a convenience rather than a necessity, and Mr. Larkins agreed with visible relief. As Purbright and Sergeant Love made their way back toward the town, the conversation behind them resumed with increased energy, as though the inspector's presence had merely compressed it temporarily. "Have you noticed his manner?" said Love, once they were out of earshot. "I noticed several," said Purbright. "The notebook."
Then, yes? Something valuable? Possibly, said Purbright, though I am not yet persuaded that its value would be measured in pounds. They crossed the railway bridge, where the town began to assert itself again, in shops, windows, and discreet observation, from behind lace curtains. News of the shed had already arrived. It travelled with admirable efficiency, assisted by interpretations that improved with distance. At the station, Purbright seated himself at his desk and placed the small envelope containing the button before him. He looked at it for a moment, then reached for the telephone. "Council offices, if you please," he said. The conversation that followed was brief and conducted in tones of easy civility. When he replaced the receiver, he made a small note and leaned back, his expression thoughtful rather than concerned. "Sergeant," he said, "it appears that the council issued a batch of working coats some years ago to various outdoor staff, groundsmen, maintenance men, and so forth. Standard brown buttons." Love nodded. "Common enough, then, very. Which makes it interesting only in conjunction with something less common. The key? Precisely. The lock on Mr. Larkins's shed had shown no sign of force. That left only two possibilities. Either it had not been locked as firmly as supposed, or it had been opened in the ordinary way." "Do you believe him careless?" asked Love. Purbright considered. "No, but I believe him capable of being mistaken, which is not quite the same thing." There was a short pause. "And if he is not mistaken, then someone possesses a key or something very like one." Love frowned. "That suggests prior knowledge." "Yes." Of the shed, and of what it contained." The inspector rose and moved to the window. Outside, a milk cart passed with the deliberate clatter of a trade that had resisted all attempts in hurry. A woman paused to speak to the driver, and the conversation took on that tone of confidential importance which Flaxborough reserved for matters not yet fully understood. "Let us suppose," Purbright went on, "that the notebook was not merely a collection of garden accounts. Let us suppose that it contained something of interest to another person, something worth obtaining but not worth announcing." Love considered this. Blackmail, perhaps, or the avoidance of it. At that moment there was a knock at the door, and Constable Briggs entered with the air of a man bearing something that might be news. "Beg pardon, sir," he said. "Message from Mrs. Pottle. She thought you ought to know Mr. Harbottle has been seen at the allotments this morning." Purbright turned slightly. "Indeed?" "Yes, sir. Just before 9, she says. Walking slowly on account of the gout. But they're all the same." Love glanced at the inspector. "I thought he had not been there for weeks." "So we were told," said Purbright. He picked up his hat. "Come, Sergeant. It seems that Mr. Harbottle's condition may be improving in a most interesting direction." Mr. Harbottle received Inspector Purbright in a manner that combined injury with hospitality, as though he had been wronged, but was determined to remain polite about it. He occupied a modest semi-detached house on the edge of the town, its small front garden arranged with a degree of neatness that suggested recent attention rather than long-standing habit. He was seated when they entered, one leg extended with careful prominence, a rug arranged over it in a way that invited sympathy. His face bore the faintly theatrical strain of a man accustomed to being asked after his health. "Inspector," he said, inclining his head, "to what do I owe this a visit?" Purbright took a chair without haste. Sergeant Love remained standing, which lent the occasion just enough formality to be felt without being declared. "I am told," said Purbright, "that you were at the allotments this morning." Mr. Harbottle's expression altered only slightly, but it altered in a direction that did not entirely favour ease. "I was, yes. A short walk. One must not neglect exercise, even under unfavourable conditions." He touched the rug with a faintly reproachful air. "I understood that your condition had prevented such excursions recently." "It has been variable," said Mr. Harbottle. "There are mornings when one feels comparatively restored." "Indeed." "And this morning was one of them?" Quiet. Purbright allowed a small pause. "You did not perhaps visit shed number 7? Mr. Harbottle's fingers tightened slightly upon the arm of his chair. "I may have passed it." "Not entered?" "Certainly not." The answer came a shade too promptly, and Sergeant Love's gaze shifted, though he said nothing. Purbright nodded as though satisfied, and changed direction with a smoothness that made the shift itself unobtrusive. "You are acquainted with Mr. Larkins?" "In this way one is acquainted with people in a town of this size," said Mr. Harbottle. "We exchange remarks, nothing more. No. Business dealings? None whatsoever." Purbright regarded him with a mild reflective interest. "I ask," he said, "because Mr. Larkins mentioned that you had shown some curiosity regarding his garden accounts." Mr. Harbottle gave a short, dry laugh. "Garden accounts? My dear Inspector, I can think of few subjects less likely to engage my curiosity. Then you have not discussed them with him?" "Certainly not in any detail." There was again that slight emphasis which suggested the possibility of some detail having been avoided rather than denied. Purbright rose as though the interview had reached its natural conclusion. "Well," he said, "I am obliged to you for your time. I hope your condition continues to improve." Mr. Harbottle inclined his head once more, though the gesture carried less composure than before. As they stepped out into the small garden, Love allowed himself a quiet remark. "He was there," he said. "Yes." "And he does not wish to say so. No, they walked a short distance, in silence." "The question," Love added, "is why?" Purbright paused by the gate and looked back at the house, where the curtain had shifted by a fraction, then settled again. "There are several possibilities," he said. "One is that Mr. Harbottle fears being associated with an incident he considers discreditable. Another is that he wishes to conceal a purpose which he considers more so." "Which do you favour?" "I do not yet favour either," said Purbright, "but I observe that his reluctance attaches itself not to the allotments generally, but to that particular shed." They returned toward the town, where the morning had advanced into that phase when activity began to resemble routine once more. Yet beneath it there remained a current of speculation which had not yet found its proper channel. At the station they found Mr. Larkins waiting, his hat again in his hands, though this time he held it more firmly, as though it might otherwise escape him. "I have brought the papers," he said, placing a small bundle upon the desk. Purbright seated himself and began to examine them. The receipts and notes were as unremarkable as expected: fertilizer, tools, minor expenses carefully recorded. Yet there was a regularity to them that suggested habit rather than necessity. "You keep these with great care," he observed. "I like to know where I stand." Quiet. He turned a page, then another, and then paused. "This entry," he said. "It appears to have been removed." Mr. Larkins leaned forward, his expression tightening. "I beg your pardon?" "There is a gap," said Purbright, indicating the sequence. "Dates that follow one another except here, where a page has been taken out. Quite neatly." Mr. Larkins stared at the book. "I had not noticed." "No?" "No." Purbright closed the ledger gently. "It is curious," he said, "how often the most careful arrangements contain a single omission." He looked at Mr. Larkins, not unkindly. "Tell me what was on that page." Mr. Larkins did not answer immediately. The question
though asked without pressure, seemed to draw something out of him that he had hoped might remain settled. His eyes moved over the ledger as though the missing page might reappear under closer inspection. "I cannot say precisely," he said at last. "Nothing of consequence, I should think. Ordinary entries." Purbright inclined his head slightly. "You will understand," he said, "that I have encountered a number of ordinary entries which have later proved to be quite otherwise." Mr. Larkins gave a faint, uncertain smile, but it did not quite take hold. "It was only notes," he said. "Deliveries, payments, perhaps a reminder or two. I am not a man of secrets, Inspector." "No," said Purbright mildly, "though even men of that disposition may occasionally keep something back, if only to avoid complication." The word lingered for a moment. Mr. Larkins shifted his weight. "There is nothing criminal in it, if that is what you are suggesting." "I am not suggesting anything," said Purbright. "I am asking." There was a brief silence during which Sergeant Love's pencil paused above his notebook, as though unwilling to commit itself prematurely. "It concerned a small arrangement," Mr. Larkins said finally. "A private matter. I did not think it necessary to record it permanently." "What sort of arrangement?" "A loan," said Mr. Larkins, a little too quickly. "A temporary one. To whom?" Mr. Larkins hesitated again, though less than before. "To Mr. Harbottle." Sergeant Love's pencil resumed its movement with quiet satisfaction. Purbright regarded Mr. Larkins with interest. "That is curious," he said. "Mr. Harbottle did not mention any such arrangement." Mr. Larkins gave a small, tight nod. He would not. "Why not?" "Because it was not formal. A favour, you might say. He preferred it not to be spoken of." Purbright considered this. "And the amount?" £5, a modest sum. "Yes, but sufficient perhaps to produce inconvenience if it were not returned." Mr. Larkins's expression hardened slightly. "It has not been returned," he said. There it was not anger precisely, but a quiet irritation that had been waiting its turn. "And you recorded this in your notebook, for my own reference? And now the page upon which it was written is missing." Mr. Larkins nodded. Purbright leaned back, his fingers lightly touching one another. "It would appear," he said, "that the person who entered your shed was not searching at random, but with a particular object in mind." "Yes." "And that object contained a record which might prove embarrassing to Mr. Harbottle." Mr. Larkins said nothing, but his silence carried agreement. Sergeant Love looked up. "Then Harbottle must be our man," he said, with the straightforwardness of a conclusion that had arranged itself conveniently. Purbright did not immediately respond. He rose and moved to the window, where he stood for a moment, looking out at the street below. A delivery van passed, its driver leaning from the cab to exchange remarks with a passer-by. The town continued, as it always did, with an appearance of mild purpose. "Possibly," he said at last, "though I have learned to be cautious of arrangements that appear too neat." Love frowned slightly. He had the motive. Yes, he was seen at the allotments. Yes, he denies it. Yes, Love waited. "And yet," said Purbright, turning back, "I am not entirely persuaded that Mr. Harbottle would trouble himself to enter a locked shed for the sake of a £5 debt, particularly when the removal of a single page would not necessarily remove the memory of it." Mr. Larkins shifted again. "He might suppose that it would," he said. "He might," said Purbright, "but I am not certain that he would." There was another pause. "Tell me," Purbright went on, "who else might have been aware of this loan?" "No one," said Mr. Larkins. "No one at all. I did not discuss it." Purbright's gaze rested on him, not insistently, but with a quiet persistence that suggested the answer might yet alter. "You mentioned earlier," he said, "that you sometimes spoke of your notebook in general terms." "Yes." "Could anyone have inferred its contents?" Mr. Larkins hesitated once more, and this time the hesitation carried a different quality. Not reluctance, but recollection. Well, he said slowly, there was Mrs. Pottle. She has a way of drawing things out. I may have said something in passing about keeping track of small obligations. Sergeant Love's pencil paused again. Mrs. Pottle, he repeated. Purbright nodded slightly. A most observant lady, he said. Yes, said Mr. Larkins with a trace of unease. Very observant. Purbright closed the ledger and placed it neatly on the desk. Then it seems, he said, that our field is not quite so narrow as it first appeared. He paused as though considering not merely the facts, but the manner in which they had arranged themselves. After all, he added, it is not always the debtor who fears a record. Inspector Purbright did not go directly to
Mrs. Pottle's house. In Flaxborough, directness was rarely the most efficient route to clarity, and Mrs. Pottle in particular was a woman whose information improved under the illusion that it was being volunteered rather than extracted. Instead, he took a slow turn through the high street, pausing where conversation gathered most naturally. By the time he reached the greengrocer's, the allotment affair had already undergone a modest but telling expansion. It was no longer merely a question of a shed, it had acquired the suggestion of something not quite above board, which in local usage could embrace a surprising range of possibilities. Mrs. Pottle herself was not at home when he called, but was said to be only just round the corner at Mrs. Bickerton's, a statement which, in practice, might indicate anything from 2 minutes to a settled visit. Purbright waited with patience that did not appear to be waiting. She arrived shortly thereafter, carrying her basket and a degree of anticipation she did not trouble to conceal. "Inspector," she said, with a tone that balanced respect and readiness, "I was just thinking you might call." "That is fortunate," said Purbright. "I was just thinking the same." She allowed herself a small, pleased adjustment of posture and ushered him inside. The sitting-room bore the marks of a life conducted with attention to arrangement. Cushions were placed with purpose, ornaments displayed with modest insistence, and a faint scent of lavender lingered as though it had been persuaded to do so. "I expect you have come about the shed," she said, settling herself. "In part," said Purbright, "though I am also interested in the notebook." Mrs. Pottle's eyes brightened very slightly. "Ah," she said, "yes. You were aware of it?" "Well, aware is perhaps too strong a word. Mr. Larkins is not a man to volunteer particulars. But one gathers things, Inspector. One cannot help it." "No," said Purbright, "one cannot." She leaned forward a little. "He mentioned once or twice that he kept notes, not just about his cabbages, if you take my meaning. Small matters, who owed what, who had done what, that sort of thing, a useful habit." "It can be," said Mrs. Pottle, "though not always appreciated." Purbright nodded. "And did he ever mention Mr. Harbottle in that connection?" Mrs. Pottle pursed her lips, not directly. "But I did observe purely in passing that there was a certain stiffness between them which had not always been the case. Mr. Harbottle used to speak quite freely of his circumstances. Lately he has been more reserved. Since when? Oh, some weeks now, about the time his gout became so very noticeable." Purbright regarded her with mild interest. "You think the two are connected?" "I think," said Mrs. Pottle carefully, "that people's ailments have a way of appearing when it is convenient for them to remain at home. A useful observation." She inclined her head, accepting the compliment with restraint. "There is another thing," she added. "On the morning in question, before we discovered the shed, I saw Mr. Harbottle speaking with Mr. Dinsdale. Quite earnestly." "Indeed?" "Yes, near the tool shed. I did not hear what was said, of course, but the manner was not casual." Purbright allowed a small pause. "And Mr. Dinsdale?" "He said very little, as usual, but he was listening." "Thank you, Mrs. Pottle,"
That is most helpful." She gave a modest nod, though her expression suggested that she had not expected otherwise. When Purbright left the house, he did not immediately return to the station. Instead, he made his way back toward the allotments, where the afternoon had settled into that quieter phase when activity became individual once more. Mr. Dinsdale was there, as it happened, working steadily along a row of beans. He straightened as Purbright approached, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement. "Afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon," said Purbright. "I wonder if I might have a word." Mr. Dinsdale nodded and set aside his tools. They stood for a moment in the narrow space between the plots, where the earth held the day's warmth, and the air carried the faint scent of turned soil. "You were seen speaking with Mr. Harbottle this morning," said Purbright. "Yes." "About what?" Mr. Dinsdale considered. "He asked if I had seen anyone about the sheds early, and had you?" "No." "What did you say?" "That I had not." Purbright watched him quietly. "And did that satisfy him?" "No." There was a brief silence. "He seemed uneasy," Mr. Dinsdale added. "More than the matter warranted." "Did he mention Mr. Larkins?" "Yes. In what way?" He asked whether Larkins kept anything worth taking. Purbright's expression did not change, but something in it settled. "And what did you tell him?" "That I did not know." Mr. Dinsdale paused, then added, "Which was true." Purbright nodded. "Of course." He glanced toward shed number 7, where the door now stood properly closed. "It is curious," he said, "how often people inquire about value without specifying what sort of value they mean." Mr. Dinsdale gave a faint, almost imperceptible shrug. "Yes." Purbright turned back. "Thank you, Mr. Dinsdale. You have been most helpful." As he walked away, the pieces arranged themselves a little more clearly, though not yet completely. A notebook, a missing page, a man who denied being present, and another who had been asked what might be worth taking. It was, Purbright reflected, beginning to resemble less a question of theft than one of knowledge who possessed it, who feared it, and who had taken steps to alter it. Inspector Purbright did not at once return to the station after speaking with Mr. Dinsdale. Instead, he lingered a little longer among the allotments, as though the ground itself might yield something further if approached with sufficient patience. There was, in such places, a tendency for the ordinary to settle back into place once the day's first disturbance had passed, but traces often remained not in objects but in habits. Shed number 7 stood closed now, its door properly latched, its appearance restored to quiet respectability. Yet Purbright paused before it, not to inspect the lock again, but to consider the pattern of movement that must have surrounded it earlier that morning. A man arriving before the others. A key, or something very like one. A brief search, not hurried, but directed. The removal of a single page, and then departure, leaving the door just sufficiently open to suggest carelessness rather than intent. He turned away and walked slowly toward the far end of the plots, where a narrow path led to a small, disused tool shed belonging to the council. It was seldom used now, having been replaced by newer facilities, but it remained unlocked, a place where odds and ends were occasionally stored and just as often forgotten. The door stood ajar. Purbright paused, then stepped inside. The interior was dim and faintly musty, the air holding the residue of long neglect. Old sacks lay in a heap, a broken rake leaned against the wall, and a length of wire coiled upon the floor. Nothing at first glance appeared of interest. Yet, as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something that did not belong to the general disorder, a small piece of paper folded once, lying near the base of the wall, as though it had been dropped rather than placed. He stooped and picked it up. It was part of a page, torn cleanly from a larger sheet. The paper bore faint pencil markings, smudged in places, but still legible enough to suggest figures and abbreviated notes. not enough to be complete, but enough to indicate that it had once belonged to something more orderly. Purbright turned it over in his hand, then slipped it carefully into his pocket. When he emerged, Sergeant Love, who had remained outside with a patience born of long practice, looked at him with quiet inquiry. "Well," he said. "Something," said Purbright, "though not yet everything." They returned to the station where the afternoon had begun to soften into that period when business slowed and reflection became possible. Purbright placed the fragment of paper on his desk and examined it more closely. "Part of the missing page," said Love. "Yes, dropped in the council shed, yes." Love considered this. Then whoever took it must have gone there after leaving Larkins's shed, very likely, and dropped this piece by accident. "Or deliberately," said Purbright. Love frowned. Why would anyone do that? "To be rid of what they did not wish to keep," said Purbright, "or to create the impression of carelessness." He studied the fragment again. The figures were small, precise, and written with the same steady hand that had produced the entries in the ledger. One line, however, had been partially erased, as though the writer had reconsidered its presence even before the page was removed. "What do you make of it?" asked Love. "I made it," said Purbright, "that the notebook was not merely a record of debts, but of something more particular. These figures are not consistent with casual loans. What then? Payments, perhaps, or adjustments?" Love's expression sharpened slightly. "You mean something ongoing, possibly?" There was a short silence. "And Harbottle?" said Love. Purbright did not answer at once. He leaned back, his gaze resting on the fragment, but his thoughts evidently moving beyond it. "Mr. Harbottle knew that the notebook contained something he did not wish to be known," he said at last. "That much seems clear, but knowledge of that kind does not always imply ownership of the problem. You think someone else had reason to remove the page?" "I think," said Purbright, "that we must consider the possibility that Mr. Harbottle's anxiety is not the cause of the disturbance, but a consequence of it. Love absorbed this. Then the field widens again. Yes. And the button?" Purbright reached for the envelope and removed it, turning it lightly between his fingers. "A common object," he said, "yet it must have come from somewhere. A coat, perhaps one issued by the council, as we were told." He paused, then added, "And the council, as you know, is a place where records are kept and occasionally mislaid." Love nodded slowly. "You are thinking of someone with access, yes, and with reason to be interested in Larkins's notes." Quiet. There was a brief stillness, as though the matter had reached a point where further progress would require not speculation, but a more deliberate test. Purbright rose. "I think," he said, "it is time we arranged a small meeting." "With whom?" "With those who have shown the most interest in what ought to have remained of no interest at all." Inspector Purbright did not announce the meeting as such. In Flaxborough, gatherings of a formal nature tended to produce resistance, while those that appeared incidental often yielded more satisfactory results. Accordingly, invitations were conveyed in tones of mild convenience, suggesting that a brief discussion might clarify matters and save everyone unnecessary trouble. By late afternoon, Mr. Larkins, Mr. Harbottle, Mr. Dinsdale, and Mrs. Pottle found themselves assembled in a small room at the police station, each with a slightly different understanding of why they were there, and each with a quiet expectation that someone else might prove more immediately responsible. Purbright entered last, carrying no papers beyond the small envelope and the fragment of torn page. Sergeant Love took his place near the door, his presence sufficient to remind all concerned that the occasion, however politely framed, was not entirely optional. "Thank you for coming," said Purbright, with the ease of a host who intended to keep his guests standing just long enough to feel the purpose of their visit. There was a murmur of acknowledgment. Mr. Harbottle seated himself with careful deliberation, adjusting his leg as though to reassert the importance of his condition. Mrs. Pottle arranged her expression into attentive neutrality. Mr. Dinsdale remained still, and Mr. Larkins looked from one to the other with an air of quiet unease. "I thought it best," Purbright continued, "to bring together those who have taken a particular interest in the recent disturbance at the allotments. It is often helpful, in such cases, to consider matters in the company." Mrs. Pottle inclined her head, as though this were a principle she had long upheld. Purbright turned first to Mr. Larkins. "You have informed us," he said, "that a page has been removed from your notebook. A page containing, among other things, a record of a loan." Mr. Larkins nodded. "To Mr. Harbottle," Purbright added. There was a slight shift in the room, though Mr. Harbottle maintained his composure with an effort that did not entirely escape notice. "A private matter," he said, "hardly of public concern." "Quite," said Purbright. "And yet it has become so by virtue of its removal." He took the fragment of paper from his pocket and placed it on the table. This was found in the disused council shed. Mr. Dinsdale glanced at it briefly, then looked away. Mrs. Pottle leaned forward, though not so far as to appear eager. Mr. Harbottle did not look at it at all. "It appears," Purbright went on, "to be part of the missing page, not enough to reconstruct the whole, but sufficient to suggest that the contents were not limited to a single loan." Mr. Larkins stared at the fragment, his expression tightening. "I do not understand," he said. "No," said Purbright, "I think you do." There was a pause. "You have been keeping more than simple garden accounts," Purbright continued. "You have been recording small financial adjustments, payments made, sums owed, perhaps even considerations offered for silence." Mrs. Pottle gave a very slight intake of breath. "That is not," began Mr. Larkins, then stopped. Purbright's tone remained even. "I do not suggest anything improper in the legal sense," he said, "but such records, if known, might prove inconvenient to those concerned." He turned his attention to Mr. Harbottle. "You, for example?" Mr. Harbottle shifted. "I fail to see you were at the allotments this morning," said Purbright, without emphasis. "I have already said you were seen," Purbright added gently. "And you made inquiries regarding what Mr. Larkins kept in his shed." Mr. Harbottle's composure wavered, then reasserted itself. "I was curious," he said. "Nothing more." "Curiosity is a powerful motive," said Purbright, "but not always sufficient to produce action." He let the words settle, then turned slightly, his gaze moving from one face to another. "It seems to me," he said, "that we are dealing not with a theft, but with an alteration. A record has been changed, not by adding to it, but by removing from it. And the question, therefore, is not who wished to possess that record, but who wished it not to exist." There was a silence in the room, not empty, but filled with the quiet calculation of several minds adjusting themselves to a new arrangement of facts. Mr. Dinsdale spoke first. "You think it was not Harbottle?" "I think," said Purbright, "that Mr. Harbottle had reason to be anxious, but not necessarily the means or the inclination to act in the manner observed." Mrs. Pottle's eyes moved, almost imperceptibly, toward Mr. Dinsdale. "And you believe," she said carefully, "that someone else did?" "Yes," said Purbright. He paused, then added, "Someone who knew of the notebook, who had access to a key or to one that would serve, and who had a reason to remove not merely one entry, but several." The room remained still. "And I think," Purbright continued, "that before we proceed further it would be useful to consider one additional point." He reached for the envelope containing the button and placed it beside the fragment of paper. "This," he said, "was found near the shed. A small thing, perhaps, but like many small things, it has a way of belonging to someone in particular. He—" looked up, his expression unchanged. "And I believe," he said quietly, "that its owner is present in this room." The effect of Purbright's last remark was not dramatic, but it was decisive. No one moved at once, yet the stillness altered. It was no longer the quiet of polite attention, but of calculation, each person, in their own manner, measuring what was known, what might be known, and what could no longer be, denied. Mrs. Pottle's gaze, which had begun by resting on the button itself, now travelled with delicate caution from one coat to another. Mr. Larkins looked only at the table, as though the answer might be found among the objects already placed there. Mr. Harbottle adjusted his position again, the movement slower now, less assured. Mr. Dinsdale alone remained almost unchanged, though the set of his shoulders had acquired a faint rigidity. Purbright did not hurry the moment. "It is a common button," he said, "issued, as we have established, with certain council garments some years ago. Not distinctive in itself, but absence, as well as presence, can be instructive." He allowed his gaze to rest, not directly but sufficiently, upon Mr. Dinsdale. "You are employed, I believe, in a capacity that brings you into occasional contact with council equipment." Mr. Dinsdale met the remark without visible discomfort. "I do odd work," he said, "here and there." "Yes," said Purbright, "and you were at the allotments this morning." "Yes." "And you were approached by Mr. Harbottle, who asked you whether anything was kept in Mr. Larkins's shed that might be worth taking." Mr. Dinsdale inclined his head slightly. He asked. I answered. Quiet. Purbright paused, then continued with the same measured tone. "And you told him that you did not know?" "That was true." "Yes," said Purbright, "in a particular sense." There was a faint tightening around Mr. Dinsdale's mouth, though it did not yet amount to expression. Purbright picked up the fragment of paper and held it lightly between his fingers. "This, too, is a small thing," he said, "a piece of a page removed from a notebook, dropped or left in a place where it might not be immediately noticed. It suggests that the person who removed the page did not wish to keep all of it." He set it down again. "Which is curious," he went on, "because if one wished merely to conceal a single entry, it would be sufficient to remove that entry alone. Yet several have been taken, and part of the page has been discarded." Mrs. Pottle leaned forward a fraction. "You mean," she said, "that more than one person was involved?" "No," said Purbright. "I mean that more than one entry was inconvenient." He let that settle. "Larkins," he continued, "has kept records of small financial adjustments, loans, payments, perhaps considerations offered for silence. Such records, though informal, can acquire significance when viewed together. A pattern, one might say." Mr. Larkins shifted uncomfortably. "I did not intend no," said Purbright, who said, "Intent is often less important than effect." He turned again, his attention returning, quietly but unmistakably, to Mr. Dinsdale. "You are a man who notices things," he said. "You have said as much yourself in your way. You observe." "You remember?" Mr. Dinsdale said nothing. "And you were aware," Purbright went on, "that Mr. Larkins kept a notebook. You may not have known its exact contents, but you knew enough to be interested." A silence followed, longer this time. "It would not be difficult," Purbright continued, "for a man in your position to obtain a key or something sufficiently similar. Nor would it be difficult to enter a shed early before others arrived and to conduct a brief directed search." Mr. Harbottle shifted again, his eyes moving now toward Mr. Dinsdale with a different quality, less defensive, more searching. "And having found the notebook," Purbright said, "you would discover that it contained not only the record of a loan to Mr. Harbottle, but other entries which might reflect upon your own dealings." Mr. Dinsdale's gaze remained steady, but something in it had altered, as though the effort of maintaining neutrality had begun to cost more than it returned. "You are assuming a great deal," he said. "Yes," said Purbright, "but I am doing so in the light of certain particulars." He gestured lightly toward the table. "The button, for example. Missing, I think, from a coat you no longer wear with the same regularity. Torn, perhaps, during a moment of haste." Mr. Dinsdale's hand moved almost involuntarily toward the front of his jacket, then stopped. "And the fragment of paper," Purbright added. "Discarded because it contained something you did not wish to keep even for yourself." There was a pause. "Such as a record," he said, "not of what you owed, but of what you had received." The words settled into the room with quiet finality. Mr. Dinsdale's shoulders lowered slightly, as though a tension had been released not by relief, but by the recognition that it could no longer be sustained. "I did not take anything that was not already misplaced," he said. "It was not a denial, and it was not quite a confession, but it was, in Flaxborough, sufficient to move the matter from speculation toward resolution." Purbright inclined his head. "No," he said, "you altered the arrangement of what was already there." Mr. Dinsdale did not attempt to retract what he had said. In Flaxborough there was a point beyond which denial became not merely futile, but socially awkward, and he appeared to have reached it with a certain reluctant clarity. He stood where he was, his hands loosely at his sides, as though the effort of explanation would be better spent elsewhere. "I only meant to see," he said. "Nothing more than that." Purbright inclined his head, not as agreement, but as encouragement. "You were curious," he said. "Yes, about the notebook." "Yes, and what it contained." Mr. Dinsdale hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "I had heard things," he said. "Not from Larkins, from others. Bits of talk. Enough to know that he kept track of arrangements." Mrs. Pottle shifted, though she did not speak. The word arrangements seemed to satisfy her sense of accuracy without quite committing itself to definition. "And you wish to confirm this for yourself?" said Purbright. "Yes. Why?" Mr. Dinsdale's gaze moved briefly toward Mr. Larkins, then away again. "Because I thought my name might be there." There was a small silence. "Was it?" asked Purbright. "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. Mr. Larkins looked up sharply. "I never you wrote it down," said Mr. Dinsdale, not angrily, but with a kind of steady resignation. That was enough. Purbright's expression remained unchanged. "And what entry concerned you?" "A payment," said Mr. Dinsdale, "for work done, not official work." He paused, then added, "It would not have been understood in the way it was meant." "Such matters rarely are," said Purbright. Mr. Harbottle shifted in his chair, his discomfort now directed less at himself than at the general exposure of the situation. "You are suggesting," he said, "that Mr. Larkins was keeping a record of private dealings?" "I am suggesting," said Purbright, "that Mr. Larkins was a careful man who preferred not to rely entirely upon memory." Mr. Larkins drew himself up. "There is nothing improper in keeping accounts," he said. "No," said Purbright, "but there may be inconvenience in having them examined." Mr. Dinsdale gave a faint, humourless smile. "Just so." Purbright stepped slightly closer to the table, his manner unchanged, though the direction of the conversation had now settled. "You entered the shed," he said. "You found the notebook. You located the page upon which your own entry appeared?" "Yes." "And you removed it?" "Yes, but you did not remove only your own entry." Mr. Dinsdale's expression tightened. "No. Why not?" "Because," he said, after a moment, "it was not possible to take only that part. The entries ran together, and—" "So you took the whole page?" "Yes." Purbright nodded. "And afterward?"
"I left," said Mr. Dinsdale. "I went to the council shed. I looked at it again." "And you removed part of it?" Mr. Dinsdale hesitated. "Yes." "Why?" "Because," he said, "there were other names." There was a slight movement in the room, as though each person present had for a moment considered the possibility of their own inclusion. "And you did not wish to retain those," said Purbright. "No, nor to destroy them entirely." Mr. Dinsdale looked at him. "I did not think it through," he said. "Not completely." "No," said Purbright. "Few things are thought through completely when they are done in haste." He allowed a brief pause. "And the button?" Mr. Dinsdale glanced down at his jacket. "It must have come off," he said. "When I was leaving, I did not notice." "No," said Purbright, "you would not." There was a quiet finality in the exchange, not imposed, but arrived at. Mr. Harbottle cleared his throat. "And my part in this," he said, "did nothing." "You were concerned," said Purbright. "You made inquiries. You placed yourself near the matter, but you did not act." Mr. Harbottle gave a small, stiff nod. "I did not wish my affairs discussed," he said. "Quite," said Purbright. He looked once more at the table, where the fragment of paper and the button lay side by side, two small objects that had, between them, altered the understanding of the whole. "It seems," he said, "that what began as a question of intrusion has resolved itself into one of discretion." Mrs. Pottle drew a quiet breath. "And what will happen now?" she asked. Purbright considered this, not as a matter of law alone, but of proportion. "That," he said, "is a question that requires a certain balance." He turned slightly, his gaze moving from one to another, as though weighing not merely actions, but consequences. "For the moment," he added, "we are concerned with establishing the truth." And in that, at least, the matter had reached its proper shape. For a moment after Purbright's last remark, no one spoke. The room held that particular stillness which follows not surprise, but recognition, the quiet acceptance that events have taken their course and will not now be persuaded to return. Mr. Dinsdale remained standing, though his posture had altered. The tension that had sustained him earlier had subsided into something flatter, less resistant. He did not look at the others, but at the table, where the fragment of paper and the button lay with an almost unnecessary clarity. "I did not mean for it to come to this," he said. "No," said Purbright. "You meant only to adjust matters to your own satisfaction." Mr. Dinsdale gave a small nod. "Yes." "And in doing so," Purbright continued, "you altered not only your own position but that of others." Mrs. Pottle shifted, her expression composed but attentive, as though the moral of the matter had not yet been fully stated. "It was not only your name on that page," Purbright went on. "There were others. Some of them perhaps are less able than yourself to explain their entries with such steadiness." Mr. Dinsdale's mouth tightened. "I didn't think it would be noticed," he said. "Few things in Flaxborough are entirely unnoticed," said Purbright mildly. There was a faint ripple of agreement at that, though no one claimed it. Mr. Larkins, who had remained silent for some time, now spoke. "You had no right," he said, though without heat. "Those were my records." "Yes," said Purbright, "and that is, in a sense, the difficulty." He turned slightly, addressing them all rather than anyone in particular. "A private record, once it becomes known, ceases to be entirely private. It invites interest, and interest, as we have seen, may lead to action." Mr. Harbottle cleared his throat. "I take it," he said, "that no formal charge will be brought." Purbright regarded him with a mild expression. "That depends," he said, "on what one considers formal." There was a brief pause. "No property has been permanently removed," he continued. "No damage has been done to the shed. The page, though altered, has not been wholly destroyed." He glanced at Mr. Dinsdale, and the intention, such as it was, appears to have been directed more toward concealment
than gain. Mr. Dinsdale gave a slight, almost imperceptible inclination of the head. Yes. Purbright allowed the moment to settle. In such circumstances, he said, it may be considered that the matter is best resolved with a degree of discretion. Mrs. Pottle drew in a quiet breath, as though acknowledging the appropriateness of this outcome, even while reserving the right to discuss it later in suitable terms. Mr. Larkins looked at the fragment of paper, then at Mr. Dinsdale. "I shall expect," he said, "that no further interference takes place." "It will not," said Mr. Dinsdale. There was no emphasis in the reply, but it carried a finality that required none. Mr. Harbottle adjusted his position once more, though now with less insistence. "And my arrangement," he said. Purbright turned his gaze upon him. "That," he said, "is a matter between yourself and Mr. Larkins." Mr. Harbottle gave a small, reluctant nod. "Yes, quiet." The meeting, having reached its natural conclusion, began to dissolve. Mrs. Pottle rose first, her composure intact, though her eyes suggested that the afternoon would not be entirely unoccupied. Mr. Harbottle followed, moving with care but without the earlier display. Mr. Dinsdale remained for a moment longer, then inclined his head to Purbright, and left without further remark. Mr. Larkins gathered his papers slowly, as though reassembling not merely the contents of his ledger, but the sense of order it had once represented. When they had gone, Sergeant Love looked at the inspector. "That is all, then?" he said. "For the present," said Purbright. Love considered the objects on the table. "A great deal of trouble," he said, "for a single page." Purbright gave a faint, almost reflective smile. "Not for the page itself," he said, "for what it represented." Love nodded. "People do not like to see themselves written down." "No," said Purbright, "particularly when they have not chosen the wording." He gathered the fragment and the button, placing them together in the envelope with a quiet finality. Outside, the town continued in its accustomed rhythm. The allotments would return to their ordinary concerns, soil, weather, and the quiet competition of growth. The shed would be closed, the tools returned to their places, and the small disturbance would settle into memory, altered slightly in the telling. Purbright sat at his desk and made a brief note, his pen moving with the same steady precision that had marked Mr. Larkins's entries, though with rather less inclination to preserve them. Curious, he said almost to himself, how much can be contained in what is not said. He closed the file, set it aside, and reached for the next. And in Flaxborough, as elsewhere, the appearance of order was quietly restored, though not perhaps entirely unchanged.